Chapter 12. Aiden had caught Emma's scent long before she'd rapped on the door of the bedroom he designated as his from the outset. When her scent threatened to affect him, he'd switch to breathing through his mouth, and even then not too deeply. Even a faint whiff of her could tip the delicate balance he was struggling to maintain. So far he hadn't become aroused enough to initiate his shift, but it wouldn't take much of a seduction effort on her part before he'd be right back where he'd been during that tense moment in the foyer, when he'd nearly shifted right in front of her. If he allowed her to arouse him again, he'd have the same damn choice: sex with her or a cold run through the park in wolf form. Because he'd chosen this bedroom originally, his clothes hung in the closet. Once he'd locked himself in here, he'd pulled on sweats and a t-shirt. That would be enough to get him through the hotel lobby, but he'd rather not go through all that. Fortunately, she'd left quickly. Had she stayed even a minute longer, he might have flung open the door and pulled her inside, because he didn't relish romping through Grant Park tonight. The risk of discovery was huge. Apparently he'd made a gross miscalculation as to the effect she'd have on him. Usually sex with a woman, or a female werewolf for that matter, left him satisfied, at least enough to put sex out of his mind for several hours, and sometimes for days or even weeks. Not with Emma. Within moments of that first shattering orgasm, his craving for her had returned. Because it had come on him so quickly, he doubted a second round would have been enough. He might have needed to have sex with her 3 times or even 4. That wasn't fair to her, not with the obligation she had the next day. He had only himself to blame for the problem. He'd foolishly surrendered to an overwhelming need to take her in semi-wolf fashion, something he'd been warned not to attempt with a human female or suffer the consequences. Although neither of them had been on all fours, the position had been close enough to subtly blend his wolf instincts with his human male sex drive. It was a powerful and dangerous combination, one he'd learned of during the private sex education classes every young werewolf had to attend upon reaching sexual maturity. According to the instructor, a werewolf could exercise reasonable control over his or her carnal desires by keeping a strict separation between animal copulation and human sex. That was easy for Aiden when he was in werewolf form. He and his she-wolf partner had one choice and one choice only. But when he was a man, choices abounded. And he was a highly sexed male who loved variety. Still, there were many interesting positions, and he'd been careful to use all the others and avoid taking a woman from behind. Until tonight. Now he understood why his instructor had been so clear on this point. Wers belonged with Wers, and the pack spread across the North American continent would be safer if it stayed that way. Human females had always been classified as an occasional indulgence, one that carried the added danger of exposing the entire Wer population. Thank God he and Emma hadn't gone the full wolf route with Aiden mounting her while she was on her hands and knees. Even lacking the intention of binding her to him as a mate, he might have strengthened the bond between them to a level that would be almost impossible to break. But all was not lost. He still might be able to override this lapse in judgment. He wasn't quite clear the best way to do that. Logic told him he shouldn't have any more sexual contact with Emma, but she wouldn't understand why, and he wouldn't be able to tell her. Maybe if they had sex, but only in the missionary position, she'd once again fit into the category of an occasional indulgence, one he could give up when that became necessary. She wasn't in that category now. Thinking of giving her up depressed the hell out of him. She was smart, funny, and sassy. He bit his lip to keep from laughing out loud when she'd pertly told him to go to hell. But her intelligence and sense of humor weren't the most compelling reasons he wanted Emma Gavin. The reason was far more basic than that: her scent drove him insane. It had from the first, and after experiencing full-body sex with her and breathing in all her enticing aromas, he was hooked. He needed advice, but he wasn't about to call Rourke. Either he'd wake his brother or interrupt him in the middle of a hot date. Either way, Rourke wouldn't be in the mood to discuss Aiden's options, especially considering Rourke completely disapproved of this bodyguard project. Aiden lay back on one of the 2 double beds in the room. Sometimes he could think better in wolf form, and by doing that he'd guarantee he wouldn't lose the battle and head into Emma's room. As much as he hated shifting against his will when he was aroused, he didn't mind it at all when he commanded it to happen. Shifting on command provided its own kind of release, And maybe in wolf form he'd find wisdom. He sure as hell could use some wisdom. The door was locked and the penthouse was quiet. If he had to guess, he'd say Emma had crawled into bed and fallen asleep immediately. She'd had a tiring day and several good orgasms at the end of it. In his experience with human females, that contributed to a good night's sleep. He quickly removed his clothes and stretched out on the bed. Then he turned to gaze at the fat snowflakes falling lazily past his window. Shifting was an art form that was, in the mature werewolf, supposed to be entirely voluntary. Aiden had always resented the genetic defect that caused his involuntary shifts, but he was proud of his ability to shift on command. The process requires something akin to self-hypnosis, and the snowflakes provided the necessary focus for his attention. As he concentrated on their easy descent, the shift began. Because he wasn't resisting it as he had when he was with Emma, the sensations caused pleasure rather than pain. Within seconds, his rich brown pelt tipped with silver covered his body and his teeth grew sharp and white. Rolling to his side, he gave room for his tail to grow until it became a sensitive extension of his body. His hands and feet became large paws, and the muscles and sinews of his arms and legs transformed until he became an animal capable of leaping a 6-foot wall at a single bound. But there would be no dramatic leaping and running tonight. Instead, he paced the room and stretched, adjusting to his wolf body and pausing to shake himself from head to tail. He cherished this wolf form when he could choose it, instead of having it thrust upon him in a potentially dangerous situation. As a wolf, he connected to the forest, to the heavens, to the moon. In the city, he couldn't see any of those things, and certainly not in this hotel room. Yet, he padded over to the window and looked out because the outdoors was his element. The window glass reflected a majestic wolf with silver-tipped fur and deep-set golden eyes. As he stood watching the snow fall onto the street below, he sensed another of his kind nearby, perhaps on the street below. Instantly his whole body tensed. In his wolf state, he could communicate with others, but only through the exchange of thoughts. He tossed the first volley. Who goes there? Friend or foe? A friend to Rhys. A foe to all who would enslave us. Shit. Theo, what in hell are you doing here? Demonstrating my tracking skills. Didn't want you to get too comfortable up there in the penthouse with Emma. Aiden sighed. Get this straight, Theo. Your little game is over. You're endangering us all, and it will stop now. I'm not the only one endangering us. Does she know what you are? No. And she won't. Liar. You'll reveal yourself because you want her. That's the act of a traitor. If that accusation inflamed Theo, so be it. Aiden wanted to draw him out, challenge him, subdue him. Are you calling me a traitor? You're taking chances like one. Care to come down and settle this now? Nice try. I'm staying here. Coward. Guardian. Silence greeted that statement. Then came the response. Because you want her. You're guarding her for yourself. Aiden left the window and paced the bedroom as he deliberately shut down his senses. But Theo's accusation echoed in his head despite the fact he could no longer hear those thoughts rising from the street below. You're guarding her for yourself. That couldn't be. He would mate with Nadia or someone of equal stature in the work community. Emma represented, as his sex education instructor had said, a temporary indulgence. Once Aiden had pledged himself to Nadia or some other werewolf princess, he would have no other. That was the werewolf code, and he would abide by it. A yearning to see Emma filled him, but if he changed back to human form, that yearning would translate into physical desire. He moved to the door, his paws silent on the thick carpet. Turning the lock took several swipes of his large paw, but eventually the lock gave way. He scratched at the door until it swung open. He hesitated. Going to her now was reckless, but he needed to see her, needed to know she was okay. Surely she'd be sound asleep after an exhausting day. Lights glowed in the living room because no one had turned them off. The gas flame still danced on the hearth because he and Emma had been too engrossed in each other to douse the fire. As a wolf, he could remember what he'd done with Emma while in the form of a man, but the memory didn't fill him with lust. He no longer desired her, but he would protect her with his life. Quietly he moved into the bedroom. Lamps on either side of the massive bed were on, casting their light over Emma, sprawled diagonally across the big bed. Her blonde hair fanned out over the pillow she cradled in both arms. She was partially covered by the sheet and a section of the black and white comforter. Then, whimpering in her sleep, she turned to her back, dislodging the sheet and exposing both breasts. In his entire life of moving between the worlds of human and were, he'd never felt sexual desire for a woman while in wolf form. It seemed he'd altered something basic in his physiology when he'd taken possession of Emma tonight in that primitive way. But he was not ruled by that change. With one last glance at her creamy breasts, he turned away. As he started out of the bedroom, her scream caused him to whirl and face her. Had Theo managed to break in? No. She screamed again, the covers clutched to her throat as she sat up in bed and stared in terror at the thing that had frightened her. Him. Shit. He bolted from the room and dashed into his bedroom. Panting, he nudged the door closed and flung himself against it in case she followed him. Then he closed his eyes and focused every fiber of his being on changing back. She'd stopped screaming, which meant she'd called the front desk. It would take them time to get here. He had maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. Do it, Wallace. Shifting under pressure was never a fun idea. Far better to take his time and ease into the new body, sort of like slipping into a warm jacuzzi. Shifting fast was like leaping into a boiling cauldron, but he could do it. He clenched his teeth against the shock, but in less than a minute he was back to being a man who could pull on sweats and a t-shirt and answer the door when hotel security arrived. 2 uniformed men, one chubby and one skinny, peered past him. Is there a chance you have a dog in here, sir? Asked the skinny one. We had a report of a dog. Actually, the lady on the phone said it was a wolf, which would be entirely against hotel regulations. We figured it had to be a large dog, but you would need to clear the presence of such a dog with the management. Aiden opened the door. You're welcome to look around, but there's no dog. It was a wolf. Emma stood in the living room wrapped in the hotel robe. I woke up from a sound sleep and there was a wolf in my bedroom. Aiden glanced at her. Emma, I think you must have had a nightmare. I did not. There was a wolf in my room. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. A huge wolf with silver-tipped fur. Search the place. It's probably hiding somewhere. Aiden hated what he had to do, but there was no choice. By all means conduct a search, gentlemen, but I guarantee you won't find anything. Miss Gavin writes books about werewolves, and she has a very active imagination. For the first time doubt flickered in Emma's blue eyes. But I saw it, Aiden. It was there looking at me. I'm sure you thought you did. He went to her and gathered her close, careful not to make it a sexual gesture. She wouldn't be in the mood, but he seemed to always be in the mood. It seemed so real. I know how that is. He rubbed her arm in a companionable way. You're sound asleep and something wakes you up, like the heat going on. You're pulled right out of your dream, and for a moment you see something that isn't really there. It's happened to me several times. I wasn't dreaming about wolves. At least I don't think I was. But it makes logical sense that you might. You're in a strange place in a strange bed. You've had an emotional day which included confronting an idiot who is trying to make you believe he actually is a werewolf. She slumped against him. I suppose you're right, but Aiden, I've never been so frightened in my life. I thought it was truly a wolf. Well, it wasn't. It was a werewolf, aka me. Couldn't find anything, ma'am. The chubby security guard came back into the living room. Ed's making sure nothing's in any of the other rooms, but we checked everywhere. Opened all the closets, looked under everything, checked in the shower. Looks like just the 2 of you are here. I'm so sorry, Emma said. I hate that you went to all this trouble for a silly nightmare. The security guard smiled. Don't think a thing about it. Part of the job. He glanced over at his partner. All clear, Ed. All clear, Ken. But if you have any more problems, ma'am, give us a call. We're up all night anyway, and checking for wolves in the penthouse is a lot more interesting than anything on late-night TV. I feel pretty foolish, Emma said. Someday I'll probably be able to laugh about this and make it into a good story, but right now it's just embarrassing. This is nothing, the guard named Ken said. You wouldn't believe the things we get called for. We had a magician whose bunnies and doves all got loose. Took us 3 hours to corral them. Keeping a supportive arm around Emma, Aiden shook hands with both men. Thanks for your time. No problem, Ken said. Lock up behind us. I will. Giving Emma a squeeze, he crossed to the door and threw the deadbolt. Aiden, I feel like such an idiot. Don't. He was the one who felt like an idiot for scaring her to death and making her doubt what she'd seen. You've been under a lot of pressure, I guess. She gave him a pleading look. But I really don't want to go back in there by myself. He'd figured this was coming, and the next few hours would be torture. But he deserved to be tortured after frightening her like that. I'll stay with you. Thank you, Aiden. But we're not having sex. Don't worry. I'm too spooked to do that anyway. Well, that's one of us. He turned off the fireplace and the lights in the living room before following her into the master bedroom. The scent of her drew him like a moth to a flame, but he would resist. With luck, his heavy burden of guilt would keep his Johnson deflated for the next few hours. Chapter 13. Emma slept the rest of the night curled against Aiden's strong body. At his request, she'd put on her pajamas and he'd left on his sweats and t-shirt. She couldn't remember sleeping more soundly in her life. When she woke up, it was with a sense of something missing. Gray light filtered through the crack between the drapes, and as she came fully awake, she realized what was missing, or rather who. Aiden had left the bed. The spot where he'd been was still warm, and she rolled to that section and sniffed the pillow. She still couldn't identify the brand of his subtle aftershave, although it had a hint of musk. Maybe today she'd ask him the name of it. In the meantime, she had to get cracking if she expected to make the drive. Time radio interview at 8:15. She climbed out of bed and headed for the master bath. Water was running somewhere in the suite, but Aiden had left the master bath to her. Just as well. One peek at him in the shower and she'd jettison her morning appointments. That thought brought her to a dead stop in the middle of the bedroom. Good Lord. Would she really behave that unprofessionally because she wanted to have sex with Aiden? Probably. And that was unnerving as hell. She'd worked too hard getting to this point in her writing career to jeopardize it for sex with a man, any man. But especially this one. Aiden had made it clear that they could hook up, as he'd phrased it, but never have a more long-term commitment than that. Had she allowed one fabulous night of sex with a talented lover to sidetrack her completely? So shame on her. She'd do well to get her priorities straight. Striding purposefully into the bathroom, she pulled off her pajamas and turned on the shower. She moved through her routine quickly and efficiently, determined to focus on what was important, namely promoting night shift. She couldn't blame Aiden for her lack of dedication, though. He'd resisted her all along. The man had been prepared to walk for an hour in Chicago's freezing cold rather than take her to bed. She'd asked him to stay. Apparently she couldn't handle the heat, though, so she'd best keep out of the kitchen. If one night with him had affected her so strongly, she'd be wise not to repeat that behavior tonight. Time for some old-fashioned self-control. When she returned to the bedroom after showering, washing her hair, and using the blow-dryer, she noticed a tray on the dressing table. It held an insulated carafe of what smelled like coffee, a cup and saucer, a small pitcher of cream, and a piece of chocolate cake that looked almost identical to the one she'd smashed into her turquoise suit yesterday. No eggs, no fruit, no bran muffin. Nothing that would have been good for her. Which was exactly the way she liked her food first thing in the morning. Some men might have taken it upon themselves to provide her with what she should be eating, but Aiden had chosen what she wanted instead. Damn him anyway. Why did he have to be the perfect man? Other than his extreme wealth, of course. But without that wealth she wouldn't be enjoying top-notch room service in the penthouse of a very expensive hotel. His money was part of him, and she hadn't exactly been suffering as she'd enjoyed the luxuries he provided so far. Still wearing the hotel robe, so there would be no chance of messing up her outfit with chocolate cake this morning, she sat at the dressing table and poured herself a cup of coffee. She could devote 10 minutes to this indulgence, which should inject enough caffeine into her system to get her through the radio show. Can I get you anything else? She turned to find him leaning in the bedroom doorway, dressed in slacks and another snowy white dress shirt open at the collar. Her wayward glance went to his belt, and warmth settled between her thighs as she remembered unfastening it, remembered the heft and feel of his cock, remembered how he'd tasted. Oh, he could get her something else, all right, but it would be worse for her than chocolate cake for breakfast. She toasted him with the coffee cup. You're aces for having this brought up. Thanks for not assuming I needed protein before my big day. I've been paying attention. He looked relaxed, leaning there with his hands shoved in the pockets of his slacks, but lines of tension bracketed his mouth. Listen, Aiden, about last night, The wolf thing? No problem. No, not the wolf thing. She looked into his caramel-colored eyes. Funny, but his eyes were the same color as the eyes of the wolf she'd imagined standing beside her bed in the middle of the night. Whoa, had doing it doggy style made her dream about him as a wolf? He sighed. We should probably talk about that, but I don't want to make you late. On the other hand, it isn't the type of discussion I want to have in front of Barry. Let me go first. She knew for certain he was about to tell her they wouldn't be having sex anymore. She wanted to be the one who said that. It was a matter of pride. All right. We can't have sex anymore. It's too distracting and I need to concentrate on my book tour. He looked decidedly relieved. I understand. Of course you do, you ratfink. If I hadn't called it off, you would have. How dare you give me the best sex of my life and then decide we should be celibate for the rest of the weekend? But she didn't say any of that. Instead, she smiled at him over her coffee cup, even though that smile took all the willpower she had. It was fun, though. Thanks for a good time. She knew it was a smart-ass comment, but he'd been ready to dump her, so she felt justified. He rolled his eyes. That sounds like something you'd write on a public bathroom wall. The eye roll irritated her more than it should have. On some level, she acknowledged that he looked way too good leaning in the doorway, and she still wanted him, which wasn't a good idea. But you'd never see it if I did. Because you avoid public bathrooms. Damn it, Emma. He pushed himself away from the doorframe. I'm sick of your remarks about my money. Maybe I'm sick of being reminded every 5 seconds that you're richer than God. Oh, excuse me, that would be wealthier than God. My mistake. Are we fighting? Yes. And it's about time. Think of it as class warfare. You're not exactly poor, Ms. Bestseller. He pointed a finger at her. You can afford a loft apartment in the village, and that's not cheap. She lifted her chin. I like living in Manhattan. I'm closer to my publisher. I doubt that's the only reason. I think you like the prestige of that loft. And you may ride the subway, but that turquoise suit has a designer label on it. What are you doing snooping through my suitcase? You said you wanted it cleaned. I came to get it while you were in the shower. Oh, thanks. She sounded ungracious, but it was tough to be grateful when he was withdrawing access to the one thing that intrigued her the most, his sexy self. Because of my name on the hotel registration, you'll have that suit cleaned and hanging in your closet by this afternoon. I appreciate that, Aiden. I'm sure you do. It's a pricey outfit. Dolce & Gabbana, if I remember right. She should have figured he'd have an eye for labels. How do you know I didn't get it at Goodwill? Did you? Well, no, but some of my clothes come from there. Anything you brought on this trip? That's beside the point. He sighed and glanced up at the ceiling. You're right. We're arguing about nothing. She couldn't stand it any longer. Although she'd acknowledged her reasons for staying away from him, he had his own reasons for staying away from her, and not knowing those reasons was driving her crazy. Taking a deep breath, she faced him. I need to be clear about something. If I don't get an answer now, it will bug me forever. He looked wary. About what? Yesterday you implied that we couldn't expect to have a relationship. Leaped on that and started complaining about your money, but I never gave you a chance to explain. Why couldn't we have a relationship, Aiden? She hated the longing in her voice when she said that, but she couldn't take it back. He gazed at her for several long seconds, as if considering his answer. You'll probably think this is medieval. Try me. The truth is, I'm expected to marry someone connected to a family with power and wealth equal to the Wallaces. Her jaw dropped. Seriously? Yes. I owe my family a great deal, and I intend to do what's expected of me. What about love? That's a modern concept and it's fine for the masses, but the masses? Are you listening to yourself? You sound like some prince from a royal family. He nodded. In a way I am. Love of family, loyalty to family are more important than my individual preferences. I can't imagine. She stared at him, unable to comprehend that kind of self-sacrifice. She would never have believed it if he hadn't told her himself. I adore my mother, but if she attempted to choose the man I marry, I would shut her down so fast. And there is the difference between us. His chest heaved. You need to get ready and I need to make a few calls. I'll meet you by the front door in 15 minutes. I'll be there. She drank her coffee quickly while she ate the cake much faster than she would have liked. Then she finished getting ready while trying to assimilate what Aiden had told her. To think of a 21st century man caving to that kind of manipulation boggled her mind. He was a person, not a chess piece. This was America, for crying out loud, the land of the free. He should be free to marry anyone he chose. But he seemed to have accepted his obligation without question. No matter how she turned the concept around in her mind, she couldn't make it fit with the strong, confident man she'd come to know. She wondered if he was afraid of losing his inheritance and all that the Wallace fortune provided in the way of bennies. He did enjoy his perks, though. From what she'd observed of his character so far, he was a man of honor. She doubted a loss of income would make him do something he didn't think was right. For whatever reason, he believed in this custom of allowing his family to dictate his marital future. In the meantime, she suspected he'd sown his share of wild oats. He enjoyed sex with a gusto that suggested plenty of experience with the endeavor. In that case, why didn't he want to sow a few more with her this weekend? He didn't, though. She'd bet her next royalty check that he'd come into her bedroom with the express purpose of calling a halt to their fun and games. She'd barely beat him to the punch. The more she thought about that decision on his part, the happier she became. He decided to back off for the same reason she had. The sex had been too intense for both of them, while she was afraid of losing focus on her career. He was afraid of becoming so attached to her that he wouldn't be able to honor his duty to his family. Greatly cheered by that conclusion, she located her purse and her satchel containing her book signing materials before walking out into the living room. Exactly at the 15-minute mark he'd set, he paced in front of the unlit fireplace, his phone to his ear. The remnants of his breakfast sat on a tray on the coffee table. Curious, she took inventory. He'd had coffee too, but from the looks of the plate he'd had steak and eggs instead of chocolate cake. Made sense. He was the big guy who would need to support all those gorgeous muscles with the right kind of fuel. She didn't mean to eavesdrop on his conversation, but short of retreating to the bedroom again, she couldn't very well help it. Oh hell, she might as well admit she'd been straining to hear what he was saying from the minute she'd realized he was on the phone. Years ago she'd accepted the fact that writers were notorious eavesdroppers. She got some of her best story ideas that way. Add to that her natural curiosity about anything to do with Aiden, and she became the human equivalent of a wiretap. Sure, Nadia. We'll be at the bookstore about 1 this afternoon. I'd love to see you. We should have time for coffee during Emma's signing. See you then. He disconnected the call and turned to Emma. Ready? Yes. She fought the urge to ask him who Nadia was. He gestured with the phone. Somebody I've known ever since I was a kid. She's going to drop by the signing. Great. And she just knew that Nadia was a potential candidate for this arranged marriage deal. He'd known her since he was a kid, which meant the two families were close. Emma read the tabloids, and she was aware that wealthy families socialized with other wealthy families, even if they lived in cities as far apart as New York and Chicago. Instantly Emma hated this Nadia person who was colluding with Aiden's family to imprison him in a loveless marriage. True, he was going along docilely, but apparently he'd been brainwashed from a young age. The whole concept just seemed wrong. Wrong as it was, though, it was none of her business. Having one really steamy night of sex with a man didn't give her the right to meddle in his personal life. This situation wasn't a plot point in one of her books. She couldn't simply rewrite the script to suit her view of the world. Yet she obsessed about the unfairness of it all during odd moments when she didn't have to concentrate on something else, like one of her 2 radio interviews or her morning TV appearance. Aiden accompanied her to all of them and stayed in the background. They didn't talk much in the car either. After the easy banter they'd shared on the plane and their sexual abandon with each other in the suite, their silences were awkward. Emma didn't know what to do about that. The day's schedule marched steadily toward the 1 o'clock bookstore event to which Aiden had so graciously invited Nadia. Whatever. Maybe her last name was Rockefeller or DuPont. Emma secretly hoped she'd turn out to be a dull and colorless woman who could hardly wait to get her hands on a specimen the likes of Aiden. That would further justify Emma's indignation, to think of Aiden shackled to someone who would bore him to tears during their first week of married life. At the bookstore, Emma snagged another coffee drink to keep her courage up for the reading session ahead. She dreaded the reading portion of the event far more than the autograph session. Signing books and talking to readers was gratifying even if it wore her out. But listening to herself read her own words aloud was pure torture because she never got over the urge to edit her work even after it was finished. Still, she was expected to read, so she did. It wasn't that she never knuckled under to satisfy others, but she wasn't into self-sacrifice, which Aiden seemed to be. Ordering his entire life to further his family's ambitions made no sense to her. As 1 o'clock drew near, the prospect of reading before an audience took on extra significance because Nadia would be there. Nadia, the albatross around Aiden's neck. Emma tried to imagine that Nadia wasn't thrilled about the arrangement either, but any woman would take one look at Aiden and think to herself, I want some of that. She certainly had. As the time for the reading approached, Aiden stood to one side of the rows of chairs and talked with the bookstore manager. Emma pretended to scan the passage she would soon be reading while watching him from the corner of her. Yep, he was certifiably gorgeous. Nadia couldn't possibly be upset about her fate. With 5 minutes to go, the chairs had filled and newcomers were forced to stand. Emma was gratified by the turnout, which was a constant source of amazement to her. When she wrote a book alone in her loft, she had a difficult time imagining all these people reading it. But they did, and for that she was very grateful. Aiden hadn't made a move toward any of the women who'd taken a seat, so Emma didn't think Nadia had arrived yet. Then he turned, as if sensing the arrival of someone. It was the oddest thing, as if he knew she was coming before she even arrived. Emma felt a pang of something that just might be jealousy. Maybe he had a bond with this childhood friend that was so strong he felt her before he saw her. Emma couldn't expect to compete with that. Or that. When Nadia rounded a bookshelf and started toward Aiden, Emma groaned softly in dismay. The woman was stunning. She moved like a runway model, and she had the figure of one too. Tall and fashionably slim she was, dressed in an elegant silver jacket and skirt that provided an eye-catching contrast to her long black hair. Gray eyes and thick lashes gave her an exotic look that any man would find intriguing. As Aiden gave her a hug, Emma felt as if someone had dunked her heart in ice water. These two obviously belonged to an exclusive club, one to which Emma would never be invited. Aiden wouldn't dread spending his life with this glorious creature. They were made for each other. Emma should count herself lucky that she'd been able to spend one night in Aiden's arms. Now that Nadia had shown up, Aiden might very well forget that Emma existed. She had to laugh at herself, thinking this morning that she'd had a decision to make as to whether she'd have more sex with Aiden. It had never been up to her. Chapter 14. When Nadia arrived, Aiden didn't sense more than one werewolf in the area, so her brother Theo hadn't tagged along. Good. He needed to talk with Nadia alone and find out what she knew about her younger sibling's mental state. Having her come to the bookstore served a dual purpose, though. It would also remind him of his responsibilities to the pack. One glance at Emma told him that she got the picture, which was another reason he'd wanted Nadia to attend the signing. He'd made so many mistakes regarding Emma, and he'd never be able to atone for all of them, but he could start setting the record straight now. He deserved her anger and resentment, both of which he saw etched on her beautiful face. Having those emotions directed at him sliced into his heart, but he would bear it. The more she disliked him, the better off she'd be. He smiled at Nadia. You're looking great. So are you. Her gaze was friendly, but there wasn't a flicker of passion in those gray eyes. Let's get some coffee. Okay, but I want a book before I leave, and I want her to sign it. Then let's buy one before we get the coffee. She might sell out. Aiden led the way through the rows of bookshelves and snagged a copy of Emma's book on the way to the cashier's counter. After paying for it, he handed it to Nadia. A small thank you for coming down. Here. I was happy to. I'd heard you were in town and I was hoping we'd get a chance to catch up. Then let's get some coffee and do that. Within minutes they were seated across from each other at a small bistro table, steaming lattes in front of them. From Aiden's chair he could glance sideways and look between a row of bookshelves to the spot where Emma stood, reading from her book. She'd chosen a forest green knit dress today, and he'd decided it was his favorite. She's very pretty, Nadia said. Who? He faced Nadia and tried to look innocent. You know who? I've been hired to keep an eye on her. So you said. Nadia looked amused. Anyway, thanks for showing up on short notice. I hope I didn't screw up your work schedule. Nah, I needed the break. I'm in the middle of designing my fall collection. And I was sick to death of hunching over the drawing board trying to think of a coat style that hasn't been done to death. This is nice. Nadia cupped both hands around her latte. So what's going on between you and Emma Gavin? Next question. Oh, so you don't want to talk about it. She took a sip of her latte. That's not very sporting of you. Aiden blew out a breath. I misjudged there. Too much heat between us. This morning I gave her the talk about my family's expectations. Nadia's gray eyes warmed with sympathy. I know what that's like. I've given that speech to a few guys. I suppose she thought you were nuts to go along with such a thing. Yeah, she did. Let me ask you something. Although no one was sitting close enough to hear the conversation, he lowered his voice out of habit. Have you ever resented the idea that you'd eventually have to marry for the good of the pack? Not yet. Meaning? Nadia kept her voice low too. It means I've never found anyone, man or were, who was worth the pain of challenging the system. She took another drink of her latte. Since you're asking that, I'm wondering if you have. Aiden quickly shook his head. Nope. Just an idle question. You've never struck me as the kind of guy who asks idle questions. Coming on the heels of you giving Emma that speech this morning, I have to wonder if she means more than you're willing to admit. She can't mean anything to me. She's human. Nadia leaned closer to him. It's not as if Werewolves have never mated with humans, Aiden. I don't know any personally. She sat back. I do. I guess you've never met my Uncle Lenny. No. He fell hard for a Las Vegas showgirl, and now Aunt Trixie is part of the family. Last year she taught me and my cousin Judy how to twirl tassels with our nipples in opposing directions. Aiden laughed. If he were the least bit interested in Nadia, that tassel twirling comment would be a turn on. Instead he just thought it was funny. Now there's a marketable skill if I ever heard one. Yeah, it was fun. She glanced at his latte. You're not drinking that. He'd completely forgotten it was there. He shoved it aside. Did your aunt continue to dance in Vegas? No, of course not. She moved here. She and Uncle Lenny have a house on the estate up in the Dells. He lowered his voice again. Virtually under house arrest, I suppose. I think she was at first, but now she's allowed to visit her family in California and stuff like that. Aiden tried to imagine Emma voluntarily giving up her writing and allowing her existence to be monitored by the work community. It would never happen, not in a million years. So much depends on the person involved and whether they're adaptable. Nadia said. Right. He shook his head. Let's get off that depressing subject. There's something else we need to talk about. She sighed. My obnoxious little brother. He's fixated on Emma. I know. He has all her books, and he boasts about how they're friends. They're not. Of course they're not. Theo's delusional. He moved into the city this summer, and he spends way too much time alone in his little apartment. I hate to say it, but I think he's got some revolutionary ideas going on. I was afraid of that. He's mentioned several times that Emma understands us and would want us to be free of what he calls stupid restrictions. Aiden groaned. Oh yeah, let's go back to the days of being hunted with torches. That would be lots of fun. I've tried to tell my dad that we need to do something about Theo, but whenever I suggest that he could bring us down, my dad says all young alphas are high-spirited. Then he accuses me of being in competition with him because one of us will be in charge someday. She shivered. Having Theo in charge is one scary thought. Obviously Theo needs an alpha male to set him straight, and soon before he drags Emma into this and causes everybody a big problem. My father should be the one to handle him, but I guarantee he's not going to. I would if I could, but I can't buck my dad on this. Then it looks like it'll have to be me. Emma looked up when she finished reading the passage from Night Shift. Aiden and Nadia still sat in the coffee shop, their heads close together as they carried on what was obviously an intense conversation. Aiden and Nadia. One name was the mirror image of the other. Their parents must have planned it that way. She felt like a naive fool. From the beginning she'd known Aiden was out of her league. He'd never pretended otherwise. She told him that some recreational sex would be just hunky-dory. Except it wasn't so hunky-dory now that she understood how fleeting that experience had been. No man had ever excited her as Aiden did. What if she never found another guy who triggered that kind of uninhibited response? Was she doomed to settle for second best? Miss Gavin, a bookstore employee, touched her on the elbow. Are you ready to autograph books now? Oh, a line had formed in front of the table, and because Emma also stood in front of the table, she was face to face with the first person in line, grandmotherly-looking woman dressed in purple sweats. Emma smiled at her. Hi there. Hi yourself, sweetie. You look so sad just now. I hope everything's okay. Everything's wonderful. If you'll excuse me, I'll just move around to the other side of the table so I can sit down and autograph your book for you. Take your time. My name's Sylvia. Say, I'm so excited about the party tonight. I didn't make it last year, but I'll be there this time. I'm coming. In costume. The party. Emma had totally lost track of what she was supposed to be doing. After the book event, seeing Nadia had torpedoed her thoughts. Then she remembered. Oh, the party. She had one more radio interview this afternoon. Then from 7 to 10 tonight she'd be the guest of honor at the monthly meeting of the Werewolfs and Wine Club, which convened in a private room above a bar in downtown Chicago not far from the Palmer House. The members were all avid readers of anything werewolf-related, and she was a popular author with the group. She'd attended once before, and most everyone came in some sort of werewolf costume. Emma appreciated their enthusiasm, but she had decided prior to her first visit to the club that she wouldn't do the costume thing. Her decision had been the same this year too. I'll look forward to seeing you there, Sylvia. She slid the autographed book back across the table. What are you wearing? A black dress. Sylvia looked surprised. No fur of any kind? I want to make sure everyone knows who I am. Oh, right. That makes perfect sense. The woman reached over and patted Emma's hand. See you there. And for the record, I love the way you write sex scenes. Thank you. Emma hoped she'd remember Sylvia by the time the party rolled around. But then again, maybe she wouldn't recognize her in a werewolf suit. Nearly an hour later, all the books were gone and Emma had signed several book plates for those who weren't able to buy a book. She chatted with the bookstore manager and expressed her gratitude. Time to wrap things up. She signed one last book plate for a latecomer. She became aware of Aiden and Nadia standing off to one side of the autograph table. Nadia held a book in her hand. Well, that was classy of her to buy a book. Even if she hadn't arrived specifically for that purpose, Emma knew full well she'd come to see Aiden. The two of them walked over to the table after the last autograph seeker left. Aiden spoke first. Emma Gavin, I'd like you to meet Nadia Henderson. Emma blinked. Theo's last name was Henderson, but surely that was a coincidence. She held out her hand. I'm happy to meet you, Nadia. Same here. I hope you don't mind signing one more book. She laid a copy of Night Shift on the table. Not at all. Thanks for buying it. Emma was determined to be gracious to this woman who seemingly had everything: looks, money, and a future with Aiden Wallace. Jealousy was a terrible emotion and Emma wanted to be rid of it. She wanted to be, but she wasn't. She longed to leap across the table and close her hands around Nadia's lovely throat. Instead she wrote, enjoy the fantasy, best wishes, Emma Gavin, in this cursed woman's book. She wondered if Nadia had slept with Aiden. Oh hell, who was she kidding? Of course they'd had sex. Two people who looked like they did and were pledged to marry someday? They'd certainly taken a test spin and kicked the tires of their future marital ride. Smiling so much her cheeks ached, Emma closed the cover of the book and nudged back toward Nadia. Too bad we can't go out for a drink or something, but I have a radio interview in 30 minutes. Of course. I need to be going anyway. Work calls. Despite herself, Emma was curious. I don't think Aiden mentioned what you do. I design organic clothing. Oh, that's terrific. Well, that was the topper. Besides looks, money, and access to the world's most eligible bachelor, Nadia ran a green business. Emma was in favor of green businesses. In another life she might have bought clothes from Nadia Henderson, but she would go stark naked before she'd buy a single stitch from the woman who would bear Aiden's children. Yes, she was being petty and unfair, but she'd had a lot of caffeine, not Enough sleep and rockstar sex with a man who would never touch her again. Girl couldn't be blamed for being a little irritable under those circumstances. So, Emma stood and gathered her things. We need to take off, Aiden. He nodded and pulled out his phone. Let's go. I'll make sure Barry's waiting in front. I'll just walk out with you. Nadia fell into step beside Emma. The bus stops only about half a block from the front entrance. Emma glanced over at her in shock. You took a bus here? Sure. Why not? Because you're loaded. I just thought you'd probably have a driver like Aiden. I can see the point of a driver for something like your book tour because you have to move quickly from place to place. No, I mean Aiden always has a driver, even in New York. Oh, Nadia smiled. I guess he hasn't seen the light. Most of my family's the same way, but I keep telling them that chauffeur thing is so last century. We need to make more conscious choices about our mode of transport. Yes, we do. Emma hated to find herself agreeing with Nadia about anything, but taking public transportation was one of her favorite causes. She glanced over at Nadia's silver suit. Is that suit organic? She seriously doubted it. Yes. I realize that's hard to believe with the metallic sheen of the fabric, but I've patented a special process to create that effect without using any toxic dyes. My mission is to make organic at least as stylish as haute couture. Impressive. Despite herself, Emma was impressed. It appeared that Aiden would end up with a wife who was intelligent and eco-conscious in addition to being a knockout. No doubt they would be very happy together. Emma wanted to weep at the injustice of it all. Barry had pulled up outside in a no parking zone, but the Wallace flag flew from the rear bumper, so Emma knew the town car was golden. She turned to Nadia and held out her hand. It's been a pleasure. I wish you and Aiden all the luck in the world, although you won't need it, I'm sure. Thank you. Nadia's grip was firm. Just so you know, he thinks you're very special. A lump formed in Emma's throat. I think he's special too. Nadia held her hand for a moment longer. Take care of yourself, Emma Gavin. I will. She turned and climbed into the car as Barry held the door open for her. Give me a second, Barry, Aiden said. I need to double-check a couple of things with Nadia. You can go ahead and start the car. You've got it. Leaving the back door open for Aiden, Barry walked around and slid in behind the wheel of the town car. I still can't get used to hanging out in illegal parking spaces, Barry, Emma said. Me either. But apparently the Wallaces have a connection with the Hendersons, and the Hendersons are big medicine in Chicago. That flag on the back is all we need for the royal treatment. That woman Aiden's talking to is Nadia Henderson. Is it really? I wondered. I've seen pictures of her and thought it might be her. Too bad about her brother, though. A cold chill slid down Emma's spine. No, the last name wasn't some weird coincidence. She kept her tone casual. You mean Theo? That's the one. Aiden told me we needed to watch out for him. What the hey? Every family has at least one bad egg. Yes, I suppose they do. And Aiden had known all about this bad seed from the beginning. No wonder he'd wanted to handle this problem personally. Emma reached in the pocket of her dress and pulled out the card Nadia had given her. Then she crumpled it into a ball and deliberately tossed it on the floor of the town car. Littering wasn't something she normally did, but she felt like breaking a few rules, getting a little rowdy. Without knowing it, she'd been a pawn in a game played by the very wealthy, and she was no longer willing to play, at least not by their. Chapter 15. Aiden wasn't surprised that Emma didn't make conversation on the way to the radio station or during the drive back to the hotel. He couldn't expect to be her favorite person after he'd asked Nadia to the book event and forced Emma to confront the harsh reality of his situation. His heart ached for her and also for himself, if he were honest, although he loathed the concept of self-pity. For a moment there in the coffee shop, when Nadia had mentioned her uncle Lenny, he'd wondered if he'd been foolish to reject Emma so completely. But once he'd heard the full story and had figured out that Emma would never go for the same deal as Nadia's Aunt Trixie, he'd fallen into despair. He never should have agreed to have sex with Emma, but he'd been weak and she'd been irresistible. She still was, and he wasn't convinced he'd ever get over her. Rourke had been right all along. Aiden should have sent someone else to handle this assignment. Too late for regrets, though. He had to see this mess through to the end and protect Emma from whatever gonzo plan Theo had dreamed up. In the process, He'd shut Theo down. Theo might be a troublemaker, but he was also a pack animal who obeyed pack rules. When a bigger and stronger alpha subdued him, he'd be forced to give up his revolutionary plans, at least while that alpha lived. Aiden expected to live a very long time, and he would be reminding Theo of his presence on a regular basis. In the meantime, he and Emma needed to eat something before they headed out to the next event. He'd noted with some concern that it was a werewolf costume party. He hoped to hell Theo hadn't heard about it. As they neared the hotel, Aiden turned to Emma. Would you rather stop for something to eat or order room service? Room service is fine. Her tone was prim. Her prim tone and room service for dinner both suited him. Sitting across from her in stony silence in a restaurant wouldn't be a barrel of laughs. When they reached the hotel, Emma got out of the car, thanked Barry, and informed him they'd walk to the party, so he was free until the next morning. As Aiden followed Emma out, Barry glanced at him, obviously wanting confirmation for that plan of action. That won't work, Emma. Aiden sensed a fight coming and hoped he was wrong. I'm not opposed to a walk, but for security purposes we need to take the car. She turned to him. Be honest with me for once, Aiden. How much security do we really need to deal with a spoiled rich boy? Or is all this elaborate security primarily designed to protect your girlfriend's family name? Aiden sighed. So you made the connection. Actually, no, I didn't. Chicago's a huge city, and I was sure it was some strange coincidence that Nadia and Theo had the same last name. While you were talking to Nadia on the curb this afternoon, Barry mentioned something to me about the Hendersons' problem child, and then it all clicked. Aiden glanced at Barry, who looked stricken. It's okay, Aiden said. I didn't tell you to keep it quiet. It's never been a secret. But it was news to me. Emma crossed her arms and glared at him. I would have appreciated knowing this factoid when you knew it, Aiden. I'm assuming you found out the night you traced Theo's email and decided you had to come along on this jaunt. Yes. So instead of being all about me, this is all about protecting the Henderson family, who will someday be your in-laws, from public embarrassment. No. My top priority is your protection. It always has been. Considering the fact that you hid your connection to Theo's family, I'm not sure I can believe you. I didn't hide it. I just didn't mention it. Same thing. No, it's not. If I'd been determined to hide it, I wouldn't have said anything to Barry. And I damn sure wouldn't have invited Nadia to your book event. Does she know her brother is the reason you came to Chicago? She does now. Emma threw up her hands. Situation solved. That's one savvy woman. She'll get her brother by the ear and make sure he behaves himself. She has a lot more to lose if he becomes tabloid fodder than you do. He won't listen to her. Aiden couldn't very well explain pack hierarchy, but Nadia, clever and accomplished as she might be, couldn't confront Theo against her father's wishes. He was the pack alpha, and Nadia had to obey him. He has parents then. Emma's breath made clouds in the cold air. Nadia can call in her parents. Hell, you can call in the parents. Why hasn't anyone done that? Why are we all tiptoeing around the problem with this kid? Aiden scrubbed a hand through his hair. He would rather not have this argument within hearing distance of the hotel doorman, but he and Emma needed to come to some sort of understanding. His parents don't believe there's anything wrong with Theo other than youthful high spirits. I've known families like that, Barry said. He seemed eager to be peacemaker. The kid is hell on wheels, and the parents don't want to see it. They keep thinking their son or daughter will grow out of it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Emma glanced at Barry. Then she studied the sidewalk and tapped her foot. Finally she looked at Aiden. Okay, we'll take the car. Good. Her expression contained sympathy. Not a lot, but some. You placed yourself in an awkward position by coming to Chicago with me, didn't you? To say the least. But you wish you'd sent somebody else. Devoutly. A hint of a smile touched her mouth. Well, I'm glad you're here. You are. He was stunned. Why? Her smile broadened. Research. Emma shared a light dinner with Aiden in the penthouse. They agreed that the long dining table felt too formal, so they ate in the living room in front of the gas fire. As if by mutual consent, they talked about everything except Theo. They discussed the interviews she'd done, the turnout at the bookstore, even the weather. She could see no point in dragging out the subject of Theo again. There wasn't anything more to say anyway. She wouldn't say she felt sorry for Aiden. Exactly. He was the engineer of his own complicated scheme and deserved whatever grief came of this weekend. But still, he'd bitten off way more than anyone could possibly chew. He'd signed on to handle what might be an impossible task, protecting her from his future brother-in-law, while keeping the problem from becoming public. Apparently, he couldn't expect support from his future mother-in-law or father-in-law. His future wife was supportive but unable to control her brother. On top of all that, he was wildly attracted to Emma, and she to him. She'd made things worse by talking him into going to bed with her. Although she couldn't bring herself to regret that experience, it hadn't been a great idea for either of their sakes. But Aiden could have stopped her cold with the complete dossier on Theo 1, containing info on Aiden's connection to the Henderson family. Had she understood why sex between them was such a bad idea, she would have made a greater effort to back away from the gorgeous Aiden Wallace. What was done, though. She'd had her romp in the hay with one of the wealthiest bachelors in the country. Her heart might be nicked, but it wasn't broken. Besides, as she'd claimed in all honesty, she would file this weekend the good, the bad, and the incredibly dysfunctional under the heading of research. No experience in a writer's life was ever wasted. At least that was the way she consoled herself when life didn't turn out as happily ever after as the endings to her books. After finishing up her dinner, she excused herself and went into the master bedroom to get ready for the party. Should I change? Aiden called after her. She paused in the doorway and turned back to him. Not unless you have a werewolf costume hanging in your closet. That would be a negative. Then go as you are. That'll be more than fine. Good. Then I'll see if the bulls are on TV. He picked up the remote. Are you wearing a costume? No. I'll be wearing the proverbial little black dress. Just curious, but why wouldn't you want to go along with the costume idea? I'm sure you could buy something at a shop in New York. Yes, but I'd look like a 5'3" blonde woman in a furry suit. Would be an insult to the magnificent werewolves in my books. Those wolves have presence. Aiden nodded. They do. I like the way you've described them, like actual wolves, only bigger and more majestic. It's a nice image. They're very much like the wolf in my dream, the one I was sure walked into my bedroom last night. Nightmares can be scary. I was a little scared at first. She rested her hand on the doorframe. But now I wish I could see that wolf again. He could have walked right out of one of my books. You're sure it was a male? Definitely a male. Big head, powerful shoulders. And there's a look in the eye of a true alpha. He had it. A look in the eye? How do you know that if werewolves don't exist? She smiled. All alpha males have that look, as if they know exactly what needs to be done and are prepared to do it. You get that look sometimes. Aiden. No kidding. I wouldn't kid about something like that. It's very attractive. She met his gaze and saw the very look she just described, focused, intense, hot. One glance was all it took to create the same sizzling awareness between them that had caused so much trouble last night. She knew without a doubt that if either of them made a move toward the other, they'd be on the floor tearing at each other's clothes. She slapped the doorframe. I need to get ready. Then she turned, walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind her. She locked it for good measure. Even a lock wouldn't stop a true alpha, but it might slow him down and make him reconsider if what he wanted was what he should have. Aiden had a powerful sex drive, and for whatever reason he was drawn to her. Exciting as it was to be wanted that fiercely, Emma wasn't willing to pay the price of surrendering. One night with Aiden had given her a benchmark for what she wanted in a man. A second night could convince her she had no hope of finding it, except with a man she couldn't have. One thing about this costume party, Aiden said as they rode the few blocks to the bar where it would be held. If Theo caught wind of it, he's liable to show up. And do what? There'll be 50 or 60 people there, at least, maybe more. Yes, it was creepy when he suddenly appeared in the bookstore wearing fake fur on his hands and some kind of fake teeth, but that was partly because nobody was around. All I'm saying is stay close. Let me know if you're going to the bathroom. Stuff like that. Which brings up another point I've been mulling over. What's Theo's goal? Aiden had some ideas about that, but he couldn't share them with Emma. I don't know for sure. I mean, he can't think he'll actually convince me he's a werewolf, so what's he really after? Aiden figured he had to come up with something, and the more innocuous the Better. He didn't want to scare her unnecessarily. Maybe just the chance to have a conversation he can brag about to his friends. I would be happy to have a conversation with him. It's the part where he claims to be a werewolf that bothers me. You don't suppose he's mentally unbalanced, do you? No. She peered over at him in the darkened back seat of the car. So the werewolf thing is just an attention getter. Something like that. I hope he's not here, Aiden. I think I'd recognize him, but in case I don't, and you spot him, let me know. If he's here, I'll know. How? He could be in full costume so you can't even see his face. I'll smell him. But he couldn't very well say that either. I'm trained to pick up vibes. Part of being in the security business is being able to pick out the bad actors in a crowd. Theo isn't exactly subtle. True. She took a deep breath. We're here. Aiden glanced out the window of the town car. A large neon sign advertised Andy's Ale House in orange letters. The main bar was on the ground floor, but he could see lights on the second floor where the party was in full swing. Barry swerved to the curb, put the car in park, and came around to open the door for them. We shouldn't be long, Barry. Aiden climbed out and offered his hand to Emma. She gave him a sympathetic glance. I'm afraid we can't just make an appearance and leave. We'll need to stay a couple of hours. Aiden sighed. Okay. See you a little after 9, Barry. 2 hours in a crowded, noisy space would be hell on his ears, but he'd deal with it. I'll be here. Barry returned to the driver's seat. Emma hugged her coat around her and gazed up at the second floor of the bar. I'm afraid this won't be anything like the place you took me on Wednesday night. You mean Jesse's? Yes. I love the atmosphere there. I do too. He longed to say they'd go again when she came back from her tour, but he knew they wouldn't. The heated glance that had passed between them after dinner tonight told him that he couldn't afford to spend any more evenings with Emma. He wanted her too much. One glance and he'd felt the beginnings of a shift. Had she stayed a moment longer, she would have heard his low growl of frustration. While she'd been in the bedroom getting ready for the party, he'd sat on the couch pretending to watch a basketball game while waiting for that shift to reverse. Thankfully, it had. We should go in, Emma said. Before we do, let me say something. He realized that out here on the street was a kind of safety zone where they could talk without anyone hearing them. And yet he wouldn't be tempted to pull her into his arms. She turned to him. I'm listening. He took a moment to enjoy how great she looked standing there in her black trench coat, a snazzy little red evening purse on a chain over her shoulder. Her blonde hair curled around her raised collar and her blue eyes. How he loved gazing into those eyes, whether they were filled with laughter or lust. Aiden? You wanted to say something. Yes. Sorry. He gathered his thoughts, which had scattered when he looked into her eyes. I want to apologize for not giving you all the information about Theo immediately. You had the right to know that he belongs to a prominent Chicago family, and that the Wallaces have ties to that family. But if you told me, chances are I never would have allowed you to come along. That wasn't the reason for not telling you, though. My father wanted me to handle this as quietly as possible so there wouldn't be any ill will between the two families. Having you in the loop wouldn't have furthered that cause. Accepted that rationale. Of course you did. He's your father, and besides, you work for him. I was angry at first, but I get it now. The thing is, I should have told you anyway. I should have trusted you with the information. Not necessarily. You don't know me all that well. How could you be sure how I'd react? I suppose you're right. But he knew her better than she thought he did. After spending 3 months watching her behavior in many different situations, he knew she was trustworthy. In any case, rest easy on that point, Aiden. I don't blame you anymore, and I promise to have only good memories of you. Same here. He fought the urge to pull her close, but that's why he was standing out on the sidewalk saying this instead of waiting until they were back in the penthouse. She clasped her hands together. So, apology accepted. Ready to face the crowd. In a minute. There's something else. Okay. When we get back to the penthouse, I'm going straight to my bedroom, and I'm asking you to go straight to yours. If we linger at all, we can't linger. Emma, I'm not that strong. Her gaze softened. Me either. So you're okay with that plan? No, but I'll do it. We have to be smart about. We just have to be smart. Yes, we do. Emma, I wish Don't say another word, Aiden. You'll only make things worse. Let's go in. She started toward the entrance of the bar. With a sigh he followed her. She was right. He needed to shut the hell up before he said something they both regret. Chapter 16. Emma, it's me, Sylvia. From the book signing. Emma peered through the eye holes of the ugliest plastic werewolf mask in the world. Hey, Sylvia. I never would have recognized you. I know. Isn't this a great mask? It's scary, all right. The werewolf's lips were pulled back in a snarl. Worthy of the creepiest horror movie. I improvised the rest. I think it works, don't you? Sylvia gestured to her baggy gray sweatsuit and fuzzy gray slippers. Absolutely. Emma took another gulp of her wine. Want to hear me howl? Oh, nice howl. Emma drank more wine. This is the best party. I've been groped twice. Groped? By whom? I don't know. That's the fun part of a masked ball, you know? This isn't exactly a ball, but we're all in disguise, so it's the same idea. A little pinch here, a little nudge there. It's all in good fun. I'm glad you're enjoying it. This was Emma's idea of hell. She liked to look into people's faces when she talked to them. That was how she gauged reactions to the conversation. Everyone here, with the exception of Aiden and the waiters, had dressed up as a werewolf. Emma stood in a sea of fur trying to get her bearings. The crowd milled around her, jostling her, sometimes stopping to chat other times. She'd initiated a few exchanges herself by commenting on the costumes. The werewolves and wine club members had been nice enough. Many of them had made a point of coming over to say how much they enjoyed her books. Few had brought copies from home for her to sign, which she did happily. These were hardcore fans, and she knew they talked her up at bookstores and on the internet. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't really need her here. She'd created the world, but they'd made it their own, and now she was extraneous. They didn't mind her being here, but they viewed her as essentially an outsider. If she'd been one of them, she would have come in costume. Throughout the evening, she'd studied the people in attendance in case one of them turned out to be Theo. She'd only seen him briefly in the bookstore, but she remembered he was tall, well over 6 feet, and lanky. She'd kept track of one guy who fit that description, but when he'd approached her, his voice had sounded nothing like Theo's. She was sure she'd recognize that voice again if she heard it. Aiden had stayed within sight, and she found comfort in watching him interact with the costume guests. He knew how to work a room, and she suspected he was working this one to make sure Theo didn't slip in unnoticed. She wondered what Aiden would do if Theo did show up. Would he take him outside and put the fear of God into him with a little physical intimidation? She didn't doubt it, as much as she'd protested that she didn't need or want a bodyguard for this trip. She was grateful to have Aiden at this party. Sifting through the crowd, he drank only mineral water, and she appreciated that too. He was working on her behalf. Sure, he was working for his family too, but he'd said her safety was his primary concern, and he was an honorable man. She believed him. She also wanted him with a fierce longing that no amount of wine could mute. No doubt other women in the room wanted him too. He looked like a model out of GQ with his hand-tailored suit and his white silk shirt open at the neck. Emma smiled as she thought of Sylvia, who wouldn't be above pinching Aiden's. But as she glided by, the noise level grew, and Emma cast a surreptitious glance at her watch. 20 minutes to go before Barry would arrive to save them. Yet once he did, they would go straight back to the hotel and separate for the night. At least, here she could admire Aiden from afar. As if he sensed her gaze on him, his head came up and he looked straight at her. She smiled and hoisted her glass in his direction, toasting his party skills. He smiled back at her, but then someone demanded his attention and he turned away again. He's a cutie pie. Emma looked for the person who'd made that comment and found Sylvia standing beside her with her mask pushed to the top of her head. She held a plate of finger food in one hand and a glass of white wine in the other. He is that, Emma agreed. Nice buns. Intelligent too. He has intelligent buns? Does that make him a smartass? Emma laughed. You're too quick for me, Sylvia. Nah, I'm just an old lady. But I've seen the way you look at him and the way he looks at you. You two would make beautiful babies together. Sorry to burst your bubble, Sylvia, but Aiden and I aren't a couple. Really? Sylvia glanced from Aiden to Emma. You look like you are always. keeping track of each other. I thought you must be together. I was hearing wedding bells. Won't be happening. Then I guess I can tell you that I did a stealth pinch move on him. Emma grinned. I can pretty much guess what that is. I'm sure you can. I sidle over, pretending I'm listening in on the conversation, and then bam! I pinch and leave. But I could barely do the stealth pinch on him. He has a very firm butt. I know. Oh really? Sylvia widened her eyes as if shocked by the news. How would you know that, Missy? I'll never tell. Sylvia set her plate down on a nearby table and waggled her finger at Emma. Men like that don't come along every day. I should know. My Ned was one of a kind. We were married for 52 years. I'm still mad at him for leaving me. He left you. Sylvia shrugged. He had to. He died. Oh Sylvia, I'm sorry. That must have been very hard. It was. I felt really punk for a couple of years. But life goes on. Picked up one of your books, and after reading it I said to myself, Sylvia, there are still men out there to pinch. So I'm back in the game. She picked up her plate again. I'm off to get more food. Thanks for keeping me young, Emma. In the general category of compliments, Emma thought that was an outstanding one. Maybe this party hadn't been such a lost cause after all. And she'd been able to Aiden watch for a solid 2 hours. About that time he walked over and stood beside her. How are you holding up? Not too bad. You? I've been pinched a time or two. Emma smiled to herself. I'm not surprised. She studied the crowd. I never did see him. I don't think he came tonight. He didn't. You sound very sure of that. Aiden set his glass of mineral water on the table next to them. That's because I am very sure of that. He didn't show, which is good. Maybe he gave up after last night's fiasco. He has a book thanks to his friend Terry. Maybe Nadia talked to him and convinced him to back off. Maybe. Someone jostled Emma and she grabbed her purse as it started to slide down her shoulder. It's really crowded in here. The party hasn't been as arduous as I expected, but I'm ready to leave. Aiden shot his cuffs and checked his watch. Barry should be down there in about 5 minutes. She couldn't resist teasing him. I saw how you did that maneuver. You like checking your limited edition watch, don't you? He glanced over at her and smiled. It's elegant. I appreciate elegance. Her good mood evaporated. Like Nadia, she said without thinking. I'll admit Nadia is elegant, he said. But so are you. Me? I'm short and stubby. Stubby? Hardly. Maybe stubby is too harsh, and I guess I'm sort of cute, but nobody has ever accused me of being elegant. He touched her cheek, his fingers very warm. Then consider yourself accused. Although he removed his hand almost immediately, Emma felt the imprint of his fingers as they said their goodbyes, retrieved their coats, and walked back down the stairs to the street where Barry waited. Elegant. He was just being nice, of course. They were close to the end of this adventure, so he could afford to be nice. In a few minutes they'd go up to the penthouse and into their isolation units, or at least that's the way she'd begun to think of their separate bedrooms. The car ride was quick and silent. Emma concluded that both of them were thinking about the night ahead and their vow not to have anything to do with each other. She forgot that they needed to give Barry instructions about picking her up for the flight to Denver in the morning. Aiden, ever the efficient one, didn't forget. Emma's flight leaves at 10:20, he said. So if you'll pick her up at 8, that should give her enough time to clear security. You're not going to the airport with me? Somehow she'd expected him to. If Theo didn't show up tonight, I don't think he'll cause a problem in the morning. He's 19. Typically they aren't morning people. So we're home free. Looks like it. Now I'll be happy to go to the airport with you if you want. Me too, but my flight back to New York doesn't leave until 1, so. No. I'll go to the airport on my own. No worries. She felt abandoned, which was stupid. She'd traveled alone for several years, and Aiden was undoubtedly right about Theo. If he hadn't made a move at this point, he wasn't likely to do so. Aiden used his key to get them on the right elevator and then into the penthouse. She'd thought of digging hers out to prove that she could get her own self into the room without having a man to do it, but the gesture seemed kind of silly, so she didn't bother. Once they were inside the confines of the penthouse, she intended to follow the rules. But if she couldn't have Aiden, she might need some chocolate cake to compensate. I'm going to my room, she said, but I'm in the mood for some dessert. He paused and looked at her. That's not code for sex, Aiden. I'm talking about actual dessert. She crossed to the phone sitting on a small table in the living room. I'm going to order up some of that chocolate cake I had for breakfast this morning. Do you want anything? Once again his expression revealed exactly what was going through his mind. I didn't mean it that way. Go to bed, Aiden. We'll get through this. Yeah. Grimacing, he turned and headed toward his bedroom. Just put the tip on the bill. Thanks for everything, she called out to him. That was lame, but she didn't think she'd see him again, and she was grateful for all that his wealth and status had provided this weekend. The sex had been good too, but she wouldn't say she was grateful. Only needy girls were grateful for sex. She was appreciative, though. She hoped he'd take her global statement as encompassing well all of it. You're welcome, he said without turning around. Then he walked into his bedroom, closed the door, and turned the lock. There was no mistaking that sound, a definite metallic click that meant he was locking her out. What the hell? Did he think she would be so overcome with lust that she'd barge into his room, even after he'd made it clear they wouldn't have sex? Tonight? She abandoned her phone call. Striding down the short hallway, she rapped on the door. Aiden, that's plain insulting. His reply was muffled by the door. What is? Locking your door, that's what. I promise you that I'm not going to encroach on the territory you've clearly defined. Now if you want to suggest that I lock my door, that's a different matter. I can't speak for yourself, control, but I damn sure can speak for mine, and you don't need a freaking lock to keep me on my side of this door. By the end of the speech, she was breathing hard from indignation, or mostly from indignation. She was also breathing hard because he was on the other side of that door, probably taking off his clothes, maybe putting on sweats and a t-shirt again, maybe not. You're right. His voice was very close to the door. A soft metallic sound indicated that the door was no longer locked. She stood by the door, contemplating whether she should suggest that maybe, if they both understood that this would be the very last time they could indulge in a little more recreational sex, just for tonight, because after that they'd never see each other again. Except for book signings, although she wondered if he'd skip those. He probably would, all things considered. Go away, Emma. How did you know I'm still here? I know. Well, I'm leaving. But I just want to say that. Don't say it. She hated being interrupted in the middle of a thought. What's wrong with telling you I appreciate the time we've had together? Hey, you're the one who told me that saying anything more would only make things worse. She sighed. So you're really serious about this abstinence plan? Deadly serious. Then I'm leaving. She walked a few feet away and paused to see if he'd open the door. You're still there, he said. You must rock out on hearing tests. Okay, I'm really leaving now. Good. She stomped into the living room, making as much noise as possible so that he'd know she was truly moving away from his door. Apparently cake was going to be her only option tonight. After ordering both the cake and a pot of coffee with a pitcher of cream, she walked into her bedroom and took off her heels. Good thing Aiden hadn't confronted her on the shoe issue, because these strappy black patent beauties were Gucci. After all the time she dinged him for his expensive tastes, she felt a little guilty about the shoes. Footwear was one of her indulgences because she'd never found an eco-friendly shoe that a girl could take dancing. Sitting on the bed, she massaged her feet. She loved wearing the shoes for about an hour. Sometime during the second hour her love always waned, and she was as eager to get out of the shoes as she had been to put them on. Barefoot, she decided to haul out her suitcase and start packing while she waited for the cake and coffee to arrive. She'd simply pretend that she was alone in this penthouse, and that there was no ripped man hiding behind door number 2. She was used to being alone on these book tours. But it was one thing to start out alone and continue on alone. Starting out with Aiden for company and then continuing on alone wasn't going to be a lot of fun. They'd been together constantly ever since they'd met at the airport, and she felt somewhat attached. Her feeling of attachment could be related to the great sex they'd had, although she believed it went beyond that. She liked talking to him, liked teasing him, even liked arguing with him. They just clicked. Intellectually, physically, and emotionally she and Aiden matched up. From his reaction to her, she'd be willing to bet he felt the same way. But he didn't dare say so because he had this archaic family obligation. She still had trouble with that. Talk about lack of personal choice. The arrival of her late-night treat interrupted her packing, and she went to answer the door. Aiden would have been proud of the way she checked the peephole first. The uniformed bellman delivering her tray was the same one who had brought dinner a few hours earlier, so she opened the door. But just to be absolutely safe, she peered into the hallway. Nobody else there. Where would you like the tray, ma'am? The bellman asked. Over by the fire? It's a nice night for a fire. So it is. She'd intended to follow Aiden's advice and close herself in her room, but she would never be in this penthouse again, so why not enjoy cake and coffee in front of the fire? That would be terrific. She walked over and flicked the switch to turn on the flames. The bellman arranged the tray on the coffee table and handed her the check to sign. She added a generous tip and gave it back. Thank you. This hits the spot. At least it hit one spot, the chocolate craving part of her. That would have to suffice. Have a nice evening. The bellman smiled and left. The door locked behind him. With a soft click, Emma sat on the sofa and fixed up her coffee exactly the way she liked it. Denver would be soon enough to begin cutting back on cream and chocolate. Tonight she needed both. Her coffee on the end table and her cake in her lap, she stared into the dancing flames and told herself to enjoy the experience, because she wouldn't have a fireplace in her next hotel room. Then she took a big bite of cake. Maybe she wouldn't cut back on chocolate in Denver after all. She'd be feeling deprived enough without denying herself that bit of comfort. The cake was gone way too soon, and sitting in front of the fire by herself wasn't nearly as much fun as she'd hoped it would be. She set the empty plate and coffee cup on the tray before standing and stretching. After turning off the fire, she carried the tray into her bedroom. She could finish off the coffee while she packed. When she decided to shut the bedroom door, she told herself it wasn't because she was putting more barriers between her and Aiden. Closing the door made the bedroom feel cozier. Too bad every time she looked at the big bed she remembered curling up in Aiden's arms last night. Her turquoise suit hung in the closet in a plastic bag, and when she checked, all the chocolate was gone. She unhooked it from the rod and pulled off the plastic so she could pack the suit in preparation for her next event in Denver on Monday. As she folded it, she heard her bedroom doorknob turn, and her pulse kicked up a notch. So Aiden had given in after all. Working to hide a smile of triumph, she faced the door. But as the door opened, adrenaline shot through her. The person coming into her room wasn't Aiden. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Theo, dressed in an old black sweatshirt and sweatpants, closed the door behind him and twisted the lock. Then he faced her looking smug. Hello, Emma. At last she found her voice. How did you get in? She was proud of herself for the calm way she said it, despite the painful thudding of her heart. I have your key. He reached into the pocket of his black sweats and held it. That can't be mine. Mine's. Not anymore. Then she remembered someone had jostled her at the party. She'd had to clutch her purse to keep it from falling off her shoulder. You were at the party? No. I hired the finest pickpocket in the greater Chicago area. As the panic slowly cleared from her brain, she realized that although he stood between her and the door, once she called for help, Aiden would be between Theo and escape. I don't know if you've thought this through very well. Once I start yelling, you'll have nowhere to run. I know, but I'm willing to take that chance. I'm hoping you won't start yelling until you've heard what I have to say. His gaze was earnest. This is critical, and you're the kind of person who will understand the issues. Lord help her, she was eternally curious about people, and he just appealed to that curiosity. She'd start yelling in a minute. With Aiden's sharp hearing, he'd respond quickly. What issues? I can tell from the way you write about werewolves that you really get them. Theo, if you're about to claim that you're a werewolf, then this conversation is over. There's not enough spirit glue and fake hair in the world to convince me that you're. She paused as he raised a hand and fur began growing on it. Blinking, she looked again. Okay, that's a trick. I don't know how you're doing it, and it's very impressive, but I want you to stop. It's creepy, Theo. It's not a turn on for me, if that's what you're hoping. You say that now, but just wait. He nudged off his shoes. Damned if hair wasn't growing on his feet, too. Stop that, Theo. You ow. Believe me yet? His voice had deepened into something resembling a growl. Good God! What are you doing to yourself? She stared in horrified fascination as the seams of his sweatsuit ripped open. This wasn't happening. She couldn't be seeing what she thought she was seeing. And yet Theo was gone. Standing in his place with bits of black fabric clinging to its black fur was a large wolf. It took a menacing step toward her. She screamed, and in the same instant her bedroom door splintered as a large form hurtled through it. Now a second wolf, larger and more powerful than the first, stood by the shattered door. The golden-eyed creature from Emma's nightmare had arrived.